Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. The house I rented looked ordinary from the outside. It had a modest porch, a small backyard, and that quiet neighborhood charm that made me feel safe. I moved in without much fuss, unpacked over a weekend, and settled into a routine. The landlord had told me the basement was mostly used for storage and had some old furniture I could use if needed. I barely paid attention to it during the first few weeks. One rainy afternoon, I decided to organize the basement and make some space for boxes I had yet to unpack. I opened the creaky door and flipped the switch, revealing flickering lights and a musty smell. The basement was cluttered but manageable, filled with old shelves, chairs, and a few covered items pushed to the corners. While moving a tall cabinet against the far wall, I noticed something strange. A section of the wall looked slightly off in color and texture. Curiosity made me press my hand against it. It felt hollow compared to the rest of the wall. I ran my fingers along the edges until I found a small gap. With a bit of effort, the panel popped free, revealing a narrow passage. Dust floated through the beam of light as I hesitated before stepping in. The air was colder and heavier beyond the wall. The hidden room was small and windowless, no more than 10 feet across. The floor was made of cracked concrete, and the walls were unfinished, exposing wooden beams and old pipes. In the center of the room were 2 stained mattresses, stacked awkwardly on top of each other. Even in the dim light, I could tell the stains were old, dark, and unsettling. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer. What disturbed me more was how deliberate the setup felt. The mattresses were not just thrown in there for storage. They were placed with purpose, like someone had spent time down there. Beside them, half buried in a dusty blanket, was a broken camera. It looked old but not ancient, the kind someone might have used a decade ago. The lens was shattered and the buttons looked worn from heavy use. I picked it up carefully, feeling the grime stick to my fingers. It was heavier than I expected. The memory card slot was empty, and I could not tell if it had ever been cleaned. There was something about the object that made me feel like I had crossed into someone else's private world. I turned it over in my hands, unsure of what I was hoping to find. Suddenly, the room felt like it was pressing in on me. My imagination began racing with thoughts I could not push away. Who had been here? Why was this space hidden behind a wall? Why the mattresses? Why the camera? I backed out slowly, placing the panel back over the opening without fully closing it. Back upstairs, I sat in silence, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the last tenant used it as a private area. Maybe the stains were not what I thought. But doubt kept creeping in, and sleep was impossible that night. I kept thinking of the dark patches on the fabric, the eerie silence in that room, and the broken camera like some forgotten witness. The next morning I called the landlord. I tried to stay calm, describing what I had found without jumping to conclusions. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the landlord spoke. He claimed he knew nothing about a hidden room and sounded genuinely surprised. He promised to come by in the evening to take a look. When he arrived, I led him to the basement. His reaction seemed honest. He said the property had passed through a few hands over the years and that he had never explored every inch. We both stood silently in front of the opening, the panel now leaning against the wall. He stepped inside briefly, then came out shaking his head. He said he would notify someone to inspect it and let me know what they found. The following day, a crew came by to evaluate the space. I watched them from the stairs as they measured and took notes. They removed the mattresses and sealed the room temporarily. I never found out exactly what the results were, but the landlord later told me he had spoken to the local authorities and there was no ongoing investigation tied to the house. Still, he understood my concern and offered to let me break the lease early if I wanted to move out. Part of me wanted to take that offer immediately. But another part of me felt like I had discovered something that had been meant to stay hidden. I kept wondering if others had lived in the house without knowing what was down there. Maybe it had been abandoned for a reason. But as days passed, the fear faded and curiosity remained. I began researching the property's history. I spent time at the library, digging through public records and old news articles. There was nothing alarming, no headlines, no missing persons tied to that address. Just a lot of empty space in the history of ownership. I was both relieved and frustrated. It gave me no real answers, only more questions. Weeks went by, and life slowly returned to normal. The landlord hired someone to renovate the basement and turn it into a proper storage area. The hidden room was completely sealed, the walls patched and painted over. New lighting was added, and the rest of the basement was cleared out and reorganized. It looked nothing like before. Even though I still felt unsettled when I thought about it, I stayed in the house. Something about facing it rather than running made me feel stronger. I kept the broken camera, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. I placed it in a drawer and rarely opened it, but its presence reminded me that sometimes the past lingers quietly behind thin walls. I eventually invited friends over and told them the story. They were disturbed, curious, and skeptical all at once. Some joked about haunted houses. Others said I should have moved out the moment I found the room. But sharing the experience helped me put distance between the fear and the facts. It helped me reclaim the space as my own. Over time, the uneasiness faded. The house began to feel like a home again. The strange chapter became something I looked back on without dread. It became one of those stories that shaped me, that reminded me of the things we sometimes uncover by accident, and how even in those moments of fear, we can choose what to do next. By the time my lease ended, I was at peace with the place. I moved out without regret, carrying with me the lessons the house had offered. I left the camera behind, hidden in the attic, not out of fear, but because it belonged to the house more than it ever belonged to me. Some things, I decided, are better left where we find them. Story 2. I had been working as a cleaner for about 2 years when I got a call for a last-minute job. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost too calm, and asked if I could clean a house located on the edge of a rural neighborhood. They offered a generous payment, much more than I usually charged. I asked for the details, and they only said the house needed deep cleaning before it could be listed for sale. Something about the way they spoke gave me a strange feeling, but I accepted it anyway. The next morning, I drove out to the address they gave me. The house was far from the main road, hidden behind a wall of trees and brush. It looked old, but not abandoned. The grass was overgrown, and the driveway was cracked, but the structure itself was intact. As I stepped out of my car and approached the front door, I felt an uncomfortable stillness settle around me. No one was there to greet me. The key was left under the mat, just like the caller had said. I let myself in and stood in the front hallway, taking in the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. The house had that closed-up feeling, like it had not been lived in for a long time. Light barely filtered through the curtains, and every step I took echoed through the quiet rooms. I started in the kitchen, scrubbing down counters and cabinets. There were still plates in the sink, coated in a thick layer of dust. I found open mail on the table, dated over a year ago. As I moved through the living room, I noticed that everything seemed to have been left in place, like the person who lived here walked out one day and never came back. It was unsettling, but I kept working, trying to shake off the feeling crawling up my spine. When I got to the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I paused. There was a room at the end of the hall with the door slightly ajar. I approached it slowly and pushed the door open. Inside was a bedroom frozen in time. The bed was made neatly, and clothes were folded in piles on the dresser. A pair of shoes sat neatly by the closet, untouched. Something about that room felt wrong. I walked around it, dusting and wiping, but my eyes kept going to the closet. Eventually, I opened it and found it empty, aside from a few wire hangers. But when I looked down, I noticed dark stains on the wooden floor beneath them. I knelt down and ran a cloth over one. It came up red-brown, blood. My stomach turned. I dropped the cloth and backed out of the closet, feeling my heart race. This was not a normal cleaning job. I picked up my phone, but for some reason I could not get a signal. I walked back into the hallway, trying to calm myself, but I felt a tight knot forming in my chest. I knew something had happened here, something bad. I finished the rest of the rooms quickly, moving like I was being chased. I wanted to be done, to leave, to never come back. But something inside me said I needed to report it. When I finally got a signal outside, I called the police. I told them I was hired to clean a house and found what looked like blood in the bedroom. The dispatcher asked me to stay there until officers arrived. I waited by my car, arms crossed, trying to stay calm. It took about 30 minutes before 2 police vehicles pulled into the driveway. I waved them down and explained everything. They asked to see the room, so I led them inside and showed them the closet. The officers exchanged a look and asked me to wait outside. I sat on the porch, watching them move in and out of the house. A few minutes later, one of them asked if I knew anything about the previous owner. I told them I had no idea who lived there before. I was just hired to clean. They told me the house was tied to a missing persons case from last year. A woman had vanished without a trace, and the house had never been fully searched. They had no leads, no suspect, no evidence. Until now, my discovery was the first real clue they had gotten. I gave them all the information I had, including the number of the person who called me. The officer dialed it on the spot, but it had already been disconnected. They said they would continue investigating and asked me not to speak about what I had seen. I agreed, though I did not know who I would have told anyway. In the weeks that followed, I was contacted again by the police. They asked more questions, trying to piece together the timeline. They brought in forensic teams, and eventually more evidence was found under the floorboards. The blood in the closet had soaked through the wood into the foundation. Though the woman was still missing, the police now had enough to name a suspect. It turned out the man who had called me was using a fake name and rented the house temporarily. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras showed a vehicle matching his description around the time of the disappearance. He was found and arrested in another state 2 months later. I was never called to testify, but they kept me updated on the case. The family of the missing woman reached out to thank me for what I did. It was strange because I had not done much. I just showed up to do my job and happened to find something no one else had. I never took another job without researching the location first. I started trusting my instincts more. That strange feeling I had when I first heard the caller's voice had been real. I ignored it, but I would not make that mistake again. That experience taught me to be more careful. Eventually, I left cleaning work behind and took on a different kind of job, one that kept me around more people and in safer places. I still thought about that house sometimes. About the quiet, about the way everything looked untouched. It stayed with me longer than I expected. Despite the fear I felt, I was glad I had made the call. It helped a grieving family find some answers, even if they were not the ones they had hoped for. There was still hope the woman would be found, or that more evidence would come to light. But at least now, her case was no longer cold. What began as a simple cleaning job turned into something that mattered. And for once, I felt like what I did really made a difference. Even in the darkest places, even when I was just trying to do my job, I helped bring some light. That thought kept me grounded long after the house was cleaned and gone. Story 3. The first letter arrived on a Thursday morning. It was placed neatly on my doorstep with no stamp, no return address, and no sign of who might have left it there. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, a type of stationery I had not seen in a long time. I picked it up cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message that read, "You are not alone," written in a familiar script. At first I thought it might be some sort of joke. Maybe one of the neighbors playing a harmless prank or someone dropping the letter at the wrong door. But the handwriting stirred something deep in my memory. I set it aside, brushed off the feeling, and went on with my day. It was not until the second letter came that I began to worry. The second letter appeared 3 days later, this time tucked under my windshield wiper. It was the same kind of envelope, the same heavy paper, the same elegant handwriting. This one read, "I still see everything." The message made my skin crawl. The thought that someone might be watching me turned that faint unease into something heavier. I tried to shake the thought and threw the letter in the drawer with the first one. Days passed and more letters came. They were always vague, but deeply unsettling. Sometimes the notes mentioned things I had done that day or thoughts I had not shared with anyone. I started to feel watched, like someone was tracking my every move. Still, I convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. It was not until I lined up the letters side by side that it hit me. The handwriting was not just familiar. It was nearly identical to someone I had known very well. Someone who had died a few years ago. My chest tightened as I looked at the curves and flourishes of the letters, the exact way certain words were written. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. I dug through an old box in my closet where I had kept letters and cards from years past. Among them were birthday cards and notes from the one person I was now thinking of. As I compared the old notes with the new letters, there was no denying it. It was the same handwriting. I felt cold all over, as though I had stepped into a place I did not belong. At first, I considered every possible explanation. Maybe someone had copied their handwriting. Maybe an old friend had found their letters and was using them to mess with me. But none of it made sense. No one else would have had access to both the private thoughts in the letters and the old handwriting samples. The deeper I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. I started to lose sleep. Every creak in the house at night made me sit up in bed. I double-checked locks, closed curtains, and kept the lights on longer than usual. The letters kept coming. Each one seemed to know more about me. They mentioned places I had visited, meals I had cooked, even memories I had never spoken aloud. I stopped going out as much. My world became smaller as fear crept in. I stopped answering phone calls, stopped inviting anyone over. I was convinced someone had found a way to spy on me. Yet, even with all the fear, there was a part of me that felt something different, an ache, a longing, a question I could not shake. What if it really was them? The idea was absurd. The person was gone. I had attended the funeral, spoken at the service, even visited the grave more than once. Still, something in me whispered that this was more than a trick. The words in the letters were too personal, too accurate. Things no one else would know were being shared with me. It was impossible, and yet here it was. I finally decided to do something about it. I took the letters to the police. The officer who met with me tried to be kind, looked at me like I was imagining things. They took the letters but said there was not much they could do unless a direct threat was made. I left feeling even more alone. It felt like no one would believe me. Back at home, I went through the letters again. One of them stood out. It said, "You still have the music box." I had not thought about that old music box in years. It had been a gift from the same person I believed was sending the letters. I went to the attic and found it exactly where I had left it, wrapped in a cloth inside a wooden chest. When I wound it up, it played the same soft melody. But tucked inside was something new. A folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note read, "I told you I would never leave." That was the moment when I finally broke down. The fear, confusion, and pain that had built up for weeks poured out of me. I spent the next few days trying to understand what was happening. I looked through old journals, emails, and photos, searching for any sign that might explain what was going on. Then I remembered something. Before they passed away, they had always said they wanted to leave something behind, something that would help me through difficult times. Could this be it? I found an old voice recorder among their things. On it was a message, dated shortly before they had passed. The recording was shaky but clear. They spoke about the letters, about wanting me to feel their presence even after they were gone. They had written dozens of notes, scheduled deliveries, and arranged for them to be left at different times. They had known me well enough to predict what I would do, how I would react. I sat in stunned silence, listening to their voice fill the room one last time. It was a goodbye that took years to reach me. But in the end, it brought peace. The fear dissolved. The confusion faded. I understood now. The letters had not been a threat. They had been a gift. A way for someone I loved to hold on just a little longer. I cried that night, not from fear, but from gratitude. I had been given one last connection, one last message, one final reminder that love does not end, even when life does. I no longer feared the letters. I kept each one in a small box, alongside their old cards and photographs. I took comfort in reading them from time to time. They reminded me of the bond we had and the care they had shown, even in planning something so intricate. The world no longer felt as cold. Eventually, the letters stopped. I was ready by then. They had done what they were meant to do. They had helped me grieve in a way I never had before. I found peace in their final goodbye. The music box still sits on my nightstand. On some nights I wind it and let the melody play. It reminds me that even when people are gone, their love can find a way back to us. And in those quiet moments, I know I was never alone. Not really. Though. Story 4. I was excited to start my new job. After months of searching, I had finally landed a position that matched both my experience and my goals. The office was clean, organized, and filled with friendly faces. On my first day, I was introduced to the team and shown around the workspace. Everything felt promising, and I was ready to give it my best. My boss made a strong first impression. They were articulate, professional, and seemed to have a clear vision for the company. During our brief conversations, they came across as confident but not arrogant, approachable but firm. I admired their leadership style and felt fortunate to work under someone who clearly knew how to run a team. But there was an ease in the way they managed everyone, and the respect they received appeared genuine. Weeks passed without incident. I became more familiar with my tasks, and I was starting to enjoy the work environment. There was a good rhythm in the office, and collaboration was encouraged. The team was talented, and projects moved quickly. I felt like I had finally found a stable place. But one afternoon, something changed. I was on a short break with a colleague when I overheard them speaking in hushed tones with another team member. They mentioned our boss's name and then said something about a different name they used to go by. I did not catch every word, but the tone was serious. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked what they were talking about. They exchanged uncertain looks before one of them leaned closer and whispered that our boss had not always gone by their current name. Apparently, years ago, they had been involved in a violent incident, served time in prison, and then changed their identity. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and unease. I had never heard anything like that before, and I was not sure if I should believe it. That night, I could not sleep. The idea of my boss having a hidden past gnawed at my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just gossip, that people exaggerate things. But a part of me needed to know if it was true. I felt like I would not be able to work peacefully without some clarity. The next day, I began to quietly search online. I looked for any past incidents, news articles, or records connected to the name I had overheard. It took time, but eventually I found something. An old article described an assault case from over a decade ago. The details were disturbing, and the name of the accused matched the one I had overheard. My stomach dropped as I read the report. The case had been serious. Someone had been severely injured. The attacker had served a prison sentence and was released after several years. The article ended by stating that the individual had changed their name and relocated after completing their sentence. There was no doubt left in my mind that it was the same person now leading our team. I tried to act normal at work, but my view of my boss had changed. Every conversation felt different. I paid closer attention to their body language, their tone, even the way they walked through the office. There was always control in their actions, always precision. What had once seemed like strong leadership now felt like calculated behavior. I started wondering if anyone else in the office knew. It was hard to tell. People respected our boss, but there was a strange distance too, as if something unspoken lingered beneath the surface. I began to notice how quickly conversations shifted when they entered the room. There was a tension I had not seen before. For days, I debated whether I should say something or just quietly resign. I did not feel in danger, but I also did not feel entirely safe. Trust had been broken, even if my boss had done nothing wrong since their release. I kept thinking about how transparency mattered, especially in leadership. Eventually, I decided to talk to human resources. I asked for a private meeting and explained what I had discovered. I made sure to present facts, not assumptions. The person I spoke with remained calm but visibly concerned. They thanked me and said they would look into it discreetly. The next week was quiet. I kept to myself and focused on my work. I did not hear any updates from human resources, and my boss acted like nothing had changed. I wondered if they had been informed or if the investigation was still ongoing. It was an uncomfortable waiting game. Then, on a Monday morning, we received an email stating that our boss had stepped down for personal reasons. There was no detailed explanation, just a formal announcement. A temporary replacement was named, and business continued as usual. The office buzzed with speculation, but no one said anything openly. Later that week, I was called back into human resources. They thanked me for coming forward and said they had confirmed the information. They also explained that the decision for the resignation had been mutual. There had been no violations at work, but given the nature of the past and the role of leadership, both parties agreed it was best. I felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. On one hand, I knew I had done the right thing by speaking up. On the other hand, I could not help but feel conflicted about what had happened. People can change, and perhaps my boss had truly moved on from their past. But leadership comes with responsibility, and that includes being transparent. With time, the office returned to normal. The new team leader was open and clear about their background, and the atmosphere felt lighter. Conversations flowed more freely, and the subtle tension that had lingered before seemed to fade. People laughed more often and shared ideas without hesitation. I stayed in the job, and over time I regained my sense of comfort. I focused on growing within the company and building trust with my colleagues. It felt good to know that my concerns had been taken seriously without leading to chaos or blame. The process had been respectful, even in its difficulty. Looking back, I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that people are not always who they seem, and that sometimes truth hides behind professionalism. I also learned that it is possible to address concerns without destroying others. There is a way to handle truth with both caution and compassion. I do not know where my former boss went or what they chose to do after resigning. I only hope they continued to live honestly, using their second chance to do good. Everyone makes mistakes, but the way we handle them matters most. I chose to act from a place of awareness, not fear. In the end, I felt stronger for having faced the situation. I grew not only in my role, but also in confidence. I knew I could handle difficult truths and make sound decisions. It was not the path I had expected when I started the job, but it led to a better one. And for that I was grateful. Story 5. I met them about a month ago, and after a few casual conversations, we decided to go on a second date. The first one had gone perfectly. We'd gone for dinner, laughed over shared interests, and enjoyed each other's company. There was a natural chemistry between us, and as the evening came to a close, I found myself looking forward to seeing them again. We agreed to meet at their place for this second date, thinking we could cook dinner together and just enjoy a quiet night in. I had no idea that night would be far from ordinary. I arrived at their house around 7 p.m., feeling excited but also a bit nervous. They greeted me at the door with a smile, looking as calm and collected as ever. The place was cozy, warm, and inviting. They had already started preparing dinner, and we immediately slipped into a comfortable rhythm, chopping vegetables and chatting about everything from our favorite hobbies to random childhood memories. There was nothing unusual about the evening at first, just two people getting to know each other better. As we ate, I noticed that there were some oddities about the way they reacted to certain questions. When I asked about their family, they seemed to hesitate for just a moment too long before responding. It wasn't a huge deal, just a subtle pause, but it piqued my curiosity. Maybe they were just a private person, or perhaps I was reading too much into it. I decided to let it go and enjoy the rest of the evening, but a small part of me felt unsettled. After dinner, we moved to the living room to watch a movie. The atmosphere was still light, and we settled in on the couch. They seemed completely at ease, but for some reason I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became, like a shadow in the back of my mind that wouldn't leave. My thoughts kept wandering, and I found myself more focused on what was around me than on the movie. It was almost as if my instincts were telling me to be cautious, but I couldn't pinpoint why. The moment they excused themselves to go to the bathroom, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. As I walked through the hallway toward the living room, something caught my eye: a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but now that it was open, I felt drawn to it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I silently moved closer to the door. I had no real reason to go in, no specific motive other than the feeling that something was just off. But something in me urged me to investigate. I quietly pushed the door open, and what I saw inside made my heart skip a beat. The room was a small closet, dimly lit and cluttered with coats and old boxes. But what really caught my attention was a pile of wallets. As I moved closer, I realized that each one contained a driver's license. There must have been at least 20 or 30 licenses, all neatly stacked. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The idea that someone would keep something like this hidden in their closet was already disturbing, but I was too shocked to process it fully. I picked up the first wallet, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened it. The driver's license inside was for a woman in her mid-20s, with a bright smile on her face. But the name on the license didn't mean anything to me. I moved on to the next wallet and the next, flipping through each one quickly, my mind spinning. It was as if each license belonged to a different person, each one carefully stored in this small, forgotten closet. But then I found one that stopped me cold. It was a driver's license from a missing persons case I had heard about on the news a few months ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. The name and photo matched exactly what I remembered from the reports. The person had disappeared without a trace, and there had been no updates in the case for weeks. I stared at the license for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing in my chest. How could they have this? Why would anyone keep something like this hidden away? And more importantly, what did it mean? My thoughts were spiraling, and I felt the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just some random collection of forgotten items. This was something far darker, something that had no business being in anyone's home. I quickly shoved the licenses back into the pile, desperately trying to cover them up with coats and boxes, but my hands were shaking. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But I knew that if I made a move too quickly, it would raise suspicion. I had no idea how to process what I had just discovered, and the fear of being caught made it even worse. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself, but my mind was already racing with questions. Was I being watched? Had they noticed I was gone too long? Just as I was about to leave the closet, I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I quickly closed the door behind me, trying to act normal. I returned to the living room just as they walked back in. I forced a smile, hoping they wouldn't notice the panic in my eyes. They didn't say anything about me being gone for a while, and I didn't bring it up either. We continued watching the movie, but I was no longer focused on the screen. My thoughts were consumed with the pile of driver's licenses I had just seen. What was I supposed to do with this information? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I kept my distance, sitting stiffly on the couch and offering short responses to their attempts at conversation. But I was so distracted by what I had discovered that I couldn't focus on anything else. Eventually, I made an excuse to leave, saying I had an early morning. They seemed disappointed but didn't argue. I quickly gathered my things and left, the unease settling deep into my chest. As I drove home, my mind was a storm of confusion and fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the licenses and the missing persons case. What was I supposed to do with this information? Should I tell the authorities? But if I did, would I be putting myself in danger? I had no answers, only more questions. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a while, trying to calm myself. The situation felt unreal, like something out of a movie, but I knew it was far too real for comfort. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept returning to the closet and the missing person's license. I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. What if I had just walked into something dangerous? What if they were involved in something far worse than I could ever imagine? I felt trapped in my own fear, unable to process what had happened. The next morning, I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. I explained everything anonymously, telling them about the licenses and the missing persons case. I was careful not to give away too much about myself, just in case. I didn't want to be involved any more than necessary. After I made the call, I felt a small sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the fear of what might happen next. Days passed and nothing happened. No police contact, no follow-up. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had misinterpreted the situation. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. I kept checking the news, hoping for some update on the missing persons case, but there was nothing. The silence only made my fear grow stronger. Then, about a week later, I received a message. It was from them. The message was short, just a single sentence. You shouldn't have looked. My stomach turned as I read the words. I had no idea what they meant, but the implication was clear. They knew I had found the collection of driver's licenses. They knew I had discovered their secret. I didn't respond. I deleted the message and blocked them immediately. But the fear didn't go away. I was left wondering whether I had done the right thing by contacting the police, or if I had just made things worse. It felt like I had narrowly escaped something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I never saw them again after that night, and I never heard anything about the case. But the memory of the driver's licenses, the missing person's face, and the chilling message stayed with me. Some things, once discovered, can never be forgotten. And some people, once you've seen their secrets, can never be unseen. Story 6. I had been looking forward to a quiet hike for days. My life had been stressful lately, and the thought of escaping into the silence of the woods was comforting. I chose a lesser-known trail, one that wove deep into the forest where few people ventured. The morning air was cool, and the path was soft beneath my boots. Birds chirped above me, and the trees swayed gently with each breeze. As I moved further into the woods, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The sounds of the city were far behind me, replaced with the rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. Or time seemed to slow down, and I let myself enjoy each moment without checking my phone or thinking about anything beyond the trail. After an hour of steady walking, I paused to drink some water and rest beneath a large oak. That was when something caught my eye off the path. A few yards to my left, the ground looked disturbed. At first, I thought it was just from animals digging or the result of some storm, but as I approached, it became clear that the area had been intentionally dug up. The earth was uneven, covered with dry leaves that had been brushed aside, and a shallow dip in the center held my attention. The shape was rectangular, just large enough for a human body. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I saw the footprints. They were recent, pressed clearly into the soft earth and leading away from the grave-shaped dip. The prints were spaced far apart, like someone had been walking quickly. My first instinct was to call someone, but I had no cell signal out there. I looked around, half expecting someone to appear from behind the trees. There was no one. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I knew I should have turned around and headed back, but curiosity pulled me forward. I followed the prints carefully, stepping over broken branches and pushing aside thick brush. The path they took was erratic, weaving between trees and curving back on itself at times. It did not feel like a normal hiking trail. Whoever made those prints was not out for a walk. The deeper I went, the darker the woods became. The trees stood closer together, blocking out much of the sunlight. My breath came slower, not from exertion but from unease. Every sound made me flinch. A rustling in the bushes made me stop, heart pounding, only for a squirrel to dart across the forest floor. I laughed nervously, shaking my head at myself, but the tension in my chest remained. I followed the trail for nearly half an hour before it abruptly ended. The footprints vanished near a large rock formation covered in moss. There were no other tracks, no sign of which direction the person had gone. I looked around, but everything felt still, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I considered turning back, but something in me wanted answers. I decided to circle the area and look for any other clues. Behind the rocks, I found a piece of cloth caught on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt, torn and dirty. That confirmed I was not imagining things, but someone had been here. I picked it up, examining it briefly before dropping it again. I had no intention of taking anything with me. This was not my story to carry. I just wanted to understand what I had stumbled onto. I made my way back toward the disturbed ground, moving faster now. The shadows had lengthened, and I did not want to be in those woods when night fell. As I neared the shallow grave again, something new stood out. The leaves around the area had shifted slightly, and there were now 2 more sets of footprints. My stomach dropped. Someone else had been here while I was following the first trail. I stood completely still, listening. There was no sound, but the air felt different. Heavy. I did not feel alone anymore. I took a step back, then another, trying not to make a sound. I needed to leave. I turned and moved quickly, not running, but walking fast enough to put distance between me and that sight. My heart pounded louder with every step. After a few minutes, I finally saw a familiar tree marking where I had stopped earlier in the day. Relief washed over me. I kept moving, not pausing until I reached the main trail. The hike back to my car felt much longer than it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something emerging from the trees. But nothing ever did. When I reached the parking lot, I was alone. My car was the only one there. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat for a moment to calm myself. My hands were shaking, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. The woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt like they were hiding secrets. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and explained what I had seen. They listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions. I showed them the location on a map and described everything as clearly as I could. They thanked me and said they would send a team out immediately. I asked if they would let me know what they found, and they nodded, though I could tell by their expressions that they did not promise anything. That night I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me sit up and listen. I kept thinking about the grave, the footprints, the torn piece of fabric. Someone had been there, maybe more than one person. And I had been close, too close. I wondered what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer. 2 days later, I got a call from the ranger station. They confirmed the area had been disturbed, but did not give me many details. They said they found evidence of digging in multiple sets of tracks, just as I had described. However, they did not find any remains or personal items. They thanked me again and said they would continue to monitor the area. I got the sense that they believed me, but that there was not much they could do without more information. But even though I did not get a clear answer, I felt relieved. I had done the right thing. I had not ignored what I saw or tried to pretend it did not happen. I went out looking for peace and found something much darker, but I did not let fear control me. In the end, I walked away unharmed, and that trail no longer calls to me the way it once did, but I still hike. I stay on well-known paths now and never go too far alone. But I refuse to let fear take away the one thing that always brought me peace. What I found in the woods remains a mystery. Maybe it was a prank, maybe something more. I might never know, but I listened to my instincts. I acted responsibly, and I came home safe. That was all I could ask for. Story 7. It was almost midnight when I heard the knock. At first I thought it was the wind or a loose shutter. The second knock was louder, more insistent. I hesitated before opening the door, unsure who would come by so late. When I looked through the peephole, I saw someone soaked from the rain, shivering and clearly distressed. I opened the door and they looked up at me, eyes wide and pleading. They said they had nowhere else to go and that they had just escaped an abusive relationship. I could see the fear in their expression, the way their hands trembled. There was something raw about their presence, something that made me believe them without question. They asked if they could come in, just for the night. I led them to the couch and gave them a blanket and a cup of tea. They didn't speak much, just thanked me quietly and sat curled up in the corner. I assumed they were in shock, maybe even ashamed. I didn't want to push for details. All I said was that they could stay for as long as they needed, and that they were safe now. The next morning I woke up early and made breakfast. They seemed more relaxed in the light of day. We talked for a bit while they ate. They shared small pieces of their story, how they had endured emotional and physical abuse for years. It was hard to hear, but I listened and offered what support I could. They said they had left everything behind and didn't know what to do next. I offered to help them look for resources, maybe find a shelter or a therapist. They nodded and said they were grateful but needed a few days to rest first. I understood and gave them space. For the next few days, they stayed mostly in the guest room. They started opening up more, becoming comfortable in the apartment. At first, I saw it as a good sign, a step toward healing. They helped out around the place and even cooked dinner a couple of times. We had long conversations about life, relationships, and second chances. It felt like I was doing something meaningful, like I was helping someone find peace. But slowly, subtle things began to feel off. They would ask too many personal questions, ones that seemed unrelated to their situation. They started going through drawers without asking, claiming they were just looking for a pen or batteries. I caught them once on my computer, though they quickly shut it and said they were just checking the weather. It was a strange excuse, but I didn't argue. Their mood shifted often. One moment they were friendly and quiet, the next they were irritable and withdrawn. They snapped at me once for accidentally moving their laundry. Another time, they accused me of looking through their things, which I had not done. It was like walking on eggshells. I tried to chalk it up to trauma, but the unease in my gut kept growing. One night, while they were out for a walk, I received a message from an old friend. They had seen a post online with a picture of someone who looked like my guest. The post warned people to be cautious. It claimed that the person had a history of violent behavior and was involved in multiple open abuse cases, not as a victim, but as the abuser. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe it was a mistake or someone trying to smear them. But curiosity led me to dig deeper. I searched for their name online and found several articles in public court records. The accusations were all too real. There were detailed descriptions from past partners who had come forward, sharing the same kinds of abuse my guest had claimed to suffer from. My stomach twisted as I read more. The timelines matched. The pattern was clear. They had used similar stories before, claiming to flee abuse in order to gain trust and shelter. It felt like a punch to the chest. I had invited someone dangerous into my home, believing I was helping them escape harm. I sat on the couch, staring at the screen, unsure what to do. They would be back soon, and I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I needed to get them out, but I didn't want to provoke them. I quietly packed a small overnight bag and made plans to stay at a friend's house. I told myself I would figure out the next step in the morning. When they returned, I stayed calm. I didn't mention anything about what I had learned. I told them I had to leave for a work emergency and would be gone overnight. They didn't seem suspicious, just nodded and went to their room. I waited until I saw the light go off before I left. The next day, I called the police and explained the situation. I gave them the details I had found and asked what I should do. They advised me to file a formal report and not confront the person directly. They also gave me a number for a local legal service that could help with removing them from my home. I followed their advice and began the process. It took a couple of days, but eventually the authorities came with the proper paperwork. I wasn't there when it happened, but I was told it was handled without incident. I returned to the apartment that evening. The place felt different, quieter, safer. I went through the apartment to make sure nothing was left behind. I changed the locks and added extra security to the windows. I also updated all my passwords and deleted anything I thought they might have seen. I wanted no trace of them left in my life. The experience left me shaken. I questioned my instincts. my ability to judge character. I had wanted to help someone in need, but instead I had been manipulated. It took weeks to feel normal again. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried they might come back. Eventually, I found peace in knowing I had taken the right steps to protect myself. I realized that kindness should not come at the expense of safety. I also learned the importance of trusting my gut, even when it feels uncomfortable. I was lucky that nothing worse had happened. Now, I am more careful about who I let into my life. I still believe in helping others, but I make sure to set boundaries and protect my space. I have not let this one experience harden my heart, but I have grown stronger because of it. The lessons I learned will stay with me for the rest of my life. In time, the fear faded. I began focusing on things that brought me peace. I reconnected with old friends, took on new projects, and created a safe environment for myself. It took effort, but I rebuilt this sense of calm that had been disrupted. I no longer dwell on what happened, but I carry its wisdom with me every day. Story 8. The warehouse always looked different at night. The lights buzzed faintly, and the shadows stretched longer than they should. My shift started at 10 p.m. and usually passed without much excitement. I walked the perimeter, checked the locks, and monitored the security feed from the small office near the loading dock. It was lonely work, but I preferred that to dealing with people. That night felt different the moment I walked in. The air smelled sharp, not foul, just chemically sharp, like something had been cleaned too aggressively. I told myself someone had probably just mopped the break room. Still, the feeling crept over me like a slow-moving chill. I tried to shrug it off and started my usual rounds. By midnight, I had made a full pass through the main floor. I paused in the office, flipped through the surveillance cameras, and saw nothing out of place. A few trucks sat quietly in the yard, and the rows of crates inside the warehouse stood undisturbed. It was quiet enough to hear the hum of the heater kick on. I got up, took my flashlight, and decided to sweep the rear section again just to be sure. I turned the corner near the back corridor and froze. There was someone at the far end of the hallway. The figure moved slowly, dragging something large and dark across the floor. I stepped into the shadows, holding my breath. The duffel bag scraped softly, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. The closer they got, the more intense the smell became. It hit me hard. Bleach, strong enough to sting my eyes. But beneath it was something else, something coppery and thick. I had smelled blood before during an injury in high school. This was blood. My stomach twisted. I stayed hidden, trying to get a better look. The person wore dark clothes and kept their head low. They struggled with the bag as if it were filled with something dense. I radioed in quietly to the off-site supervisor, giving my location and the situation. He told me to stay back and wait for local authorities to arrive. I hated doing nothing, but protocol was clear. The figure turned down a side hallway leading to a disused section of the warehouse. I followed quietly, keeping to the walls. My flashlight stayed off. I could hear the bag dragging, the zipper bouncing against the concrete. They stopped near a metal door and fumbled with something in their coat. I crept closer, just enough to see they were unlocking a maintenance closet. When they opened it, I caught a glimpse inside. Stains marked the floor. There were cleaning supplies, but nothing else that explained why they were there with that bag. I stepped back, not wanting to be seen. Then something unexpected happened. The figure turned suddenly and looked in my direction. I ducked behind a support beam, heart pounding. I heard footsteps, heavy, hurried footsteps. Then the dragging sound again, faster this time. I waited a moment and peeked back around. The hallway was empty. The closet door was open, but the person was gone. I walked slowly toward the closet, keeping my flashlight low. The smell was overwhelming now, and my hands trembled slightly as I approached the bag. I did not want to open it, but I had to know. I nudged it gently with my boot. It was soft in some places, lumpy in others. I squatted down and slowly unzipped one side. Inside were rags soaked and smeared. Clothing too, ripped and dirty. The bleach had not covered the metallic odor. I zipped it back up and stepped away. I heard the distant wail of sirens. The supervisor must have called it in. I stood there, unsure of what to do next. I kept my eyes on the hallway, listening for any sound. Minutes passed before the flashing lights bounced through the small windows high above. Two officers entered with flashlights and asked me to step back. I told them what I had seen and where the person had gone. They took my statement while others searched the warehouse. I pointed them toward the closet and the bag. The officers looked grim when they saw it. They asked to review the surveillance footage. I led them to the office and brought up the feed. To my surprise, there was no trace of the figure on the cameras. Not in the hallway, not at the closet, not even in the entrance where they should have been. The camera in that section had gone black for a period that matched the exact time the person appeared. It did not make sense. I knew what I had seen. I had smelled it, followed it, and even touched that bag. But there was no proof. The officers looked skeptical, but they took the bag as evidence. One of them suggested it might be an internal prank or a misunderstanding, but I knew better. After they left, I could not focus. I kept thinking about the blank footage, the bleach, and how the person vanished. The rest of the shift passed in a haze. I jumped at every sound and checked every camera feed twice. Nothing else happened that night. The next day, I was called in for a meeting with management. They had reviewed the situation and wanted to follow protocol. I was placed on a temporary leave while they investigated. It felt like a punishment, even though I had done everything right. A few days later, I received a call. The officers had traced the clothing in the bag to a missing persons case from a nearby town. The person had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. The case was now being treated as active and potentially connected to other disappearances. That changed everything. I was cleared and thanked for my report. The warehouse installed new cameras and improved security. They even offered to promote me to oversee the changes. I accepted, hoping that staying would help bring some closure. I still work there, but the night shifts feel heavier now. I double-check every corner and walk slower through the back halls. That closet has been sealed shut, and no one uses that corridor anymore. The smell is gone, but the memory of it lingers. Sometimes when I walk past the spot where I first saw the figure, I pause and listen. I have never seen them again, but I remain alert. That night changed how I see the job, and in some ways how I see the world. I did not expect to find danger in a quiet warehouse, but I was glad I followed my instincts. Now, every shift begins the same way. I turn on the monitors, check the doors, and tell myself to be ready for anything. The fear has faded, but the awareness stays. I caught a glimpse of something dark that night, and I was lucky it did not see me first. That thought alone keeps me careful and grateful. Story 9. The invitation came casually, passed to me across the fence earlier in the week. My neighbor was hosting a barbecue on Saturday afternoon and said I should drop by. It had been a while since I'd done anything social, so I agreed even though I felt a little uneasy. I chalked that feeling up to being overworked and tired lately. When the day arrived, I grabbed a drink, walked over, and tried to enjoy myself. The smell of grilled meat filled the yard, and the sound of laughter floated on the breeze. A few folding chairs were scattered around, and people gathered in small groups talking about nothing important. I tried to join a conversation or two, but I never stayed in one place long. It felt like I was drifting through the event rather than part of it. I noticed that the backyard had been cleaned up more than usual, with the grass cut low and garden tools put away. After grabbing a plate of food and sitting by myself for a bit, I decided to wander around. I was not snooping, just stretching my legs and taking in the space. The yard extended further than I had expected, with a small shed tucked into the far right corner, partially obscured by trees. I walked toward it out of curiosity, mostly just trying to avoid awkward small talk. As I neared the shed, something behind it caught my attention. There was a shape on the ground, mostly hidden behind the structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of garbage or old supplies. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. A large tarp had been tossed carelessly into the grass, and it was soaked in something dark and thick. The stain had spread across the fabric, the color unmistakably red. My stomach turned as the reality sank in. I stopped walking and just stood there for a moment. The voices behind me sounded distant, as if muffled by a thick wall. I crouched slightly and leaned in to get a better look without touching anything. The red had soaked deeply into the tarp, and there were streaks that looked like something had been dragged across it. The smell hit me next, sharp and metallic. I stood up quickly and stepped back, unsure of what I had just found. My first instinct was to say something to someone, but I hesitated. I was a guest, and I had no idea what was going on. What if it was nothing? What if I was overreacting? Maybe an animal had been injured or a hunting accident had occurred, and this was just the aftermath. But the way it had been hidden behind the shed did not sit right with me. I walked back toward the party, my mind racing. No one seemed to notice that I had been gone or that I was acting strange. People were still eating, drinking, and laughing like everything was perfectly normal. I stood at the edge of the gathering, staring at my half-eaten food. I needed to do something. I could not just walk away from what I had seen. After a few minutes of trying to appear calm, I pulled out my phone and walked down the side of the house. I dialed the local authorities and explained what I had found without giving too much detail. They said they would send someone to check it out. I hung up and stood there, wondering if I had done the right thing. My heart was pounding, and my hands were sweating. I went back to the party and stayed near the fence, waiting. It felt like an eternity before the patrol car arrived. When the officers entered the yard, the mood shifted instantly. People turned their heads, watching as they walked toward the back. My neighbor looked surprised, even confused, but tried to act casual. The officers spoke to them briefly before heading toward the shed. I watched from a distance as they rounded the corner and found the tarp. One of them pulled on gloves and lifted the edge. The other officer spoke into his radio, and within minutes, more units arrived. The barbecue was over, People began to whisper and gather their things, glancing over at the shed. I stayed where I was, unsure if I should leave or stay to answer questions. Eventually, one of the officers approached me. I explained how I had found the tarp and why I had called. They asked me to stay while they continued their investigation. The area behind the shed was taped off, and a forensics team arrived to examine the scene. I sat on the back steps, sipping from a warm bottle of water, unable to stop replaying the moment I saw the blood for the first time. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I gave a full statement and waited until I was allowed to leave. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep, my thoughts spiraling. I kept thinking about all the people at the barbecue, chatting and smiling, completely unaware. I kept wondering what might have happened if I had not gone for that walk behind the shed. Part of me felt guilty, and part of me felt relieved. The next few days were filled with updates and whispers around the neighborhood. The authorities had confirmed that the blood was human and that a body had been buried nearby, just beyond the shed. No one had been arrested yet, but they were investigating. The entire block felt different now, like something had cracked open and could never be closed again. People looked at each other with suspicion, and conversations became shorter. I avoided most of my neighbors and kept to myself. I did not want to be dragged into rumors or speculation. I had done what I could, and now I just wanted to move on. The scene was still fresh in my mind, but I tried to push it back, focusing on my routine. Life returned to something close to normal, but the unease lingered. Weeks passed, and finally, the investigation concluded. It turned out that the body belonged to a transient man who had been squatting in an abandoned building nearby. The neighbor hosting the barbecue had found him trespassing weeks earlier, and an altercation had occurred. Things escalated, and instead of calling for help, they had panicked and tried to hide what happened. It had been a terrible choice born out of fear. The arrest happened quietly, and most people in the neighborhood were shocked. No one had suspected anything. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Sadness for what had happened to the man, anger at the cover-up, and a strange sense of peace knowing that I had helped uncover the truth. Eventually, the yard was cleared out. The shed was torn down, and the area was cleaned. A new family moved into the house months later, unaware of its history. I watched them from my kitchen window, hoping they would have a fresh start. I never told them what had happened. Some things are better left in the past. I learned something about myself through it all. I realized that sometimes doing the right thing means acting when no one else will. It means listening to that gut feeling, even when it would be easier to ignore it. A day at the barbecue changed me. It reminded me that evil can hide in plain sight, and that courage sometimes looks like a simple phone call. Now, every time I walk past that house, I think about how different things could have been. I think about how a short walk behind a shed revealed something no one else had noticed. I do not feel fear when I remember it. I feel proud that I did not walk away, and I remind myself that paying attention matters more than we think. Story 10. It started when I was using my friend's old laptop. They had upgraded and asked if I wanted their old one before they wiped it clean. I agreed, thinking I could use it for simple tasks and not have to switch between devices. They said they had already cleared everything important, but as I opened the laptop, I noticed it was still logged into some sites. Out of habit, I checked the browser history before clearing it, just to make sure nothing would interfere with my own logins. That was when I saw the forum. The site's name was strange and vague. but curiosity pulled me in. I clicked the link, not really expecting anything serious. The layout was dark, minimal, and filled with usernames I did not recognize. But what caught my attention were the threads, all titled with numbers and crimes. They weren't just discussing crime stories or fictional scenarios. They were writing about real crimes they had committed, and other users would rate them. At first, I thought it had to be fake. People don't just post crimes online and expect to get away with it. But as I read through a few entries, I realized how serious it all was. The descriptions were too specific, too personal to be made up. There were small details, local references, even mentions of tools or methods that made it clear these were first-hand experiences. The replies were even worse, filled with encouragement, suggestions, and rankings based on how impressive or violent the crimes were. One thread in particular grabbed me because of the tone and style of the post. It felt familiar. The phrasing, the grammar, even the way the story was broken into short parts reminded me of someone I knew well. My stomach dropped when I saw their username. It was a variation of a nickname only a few people would know, and there was no mistaking it. I scrolled through the post, hoping for some sign that it was a joke or a fake, but it wasn't. They had written about an incident from a few years ago, something they had only vaguely mentioned once before. I remembered that day clearly. They had come over, visibly shaken, saying they had gotten into something they didn't want to talk about. I thought they had just had a bad night, maybe a breakup or a personal mistake. I had offered them comfort without asking for details. But now I knew the truth. They had committed a crime and now they were bragging about it to strangers. My hands were shaking as I kept reading. Post after post, they detailed other acts, some small, others not. The theft, break-ins, even physical harm. Each story ended with a self-rating and replies from others congratulating them. I felt sick. This wasn't the person I thought I knew. This was someone else, someone dangerous, hiding in plain sight. I sat back, stunned, unsure what to do. I thought about confronting them, asking for an explanation. But what could they possibly say that would justify any of this? I couldn't look at them the same way ever again. We had shared so much birthdays, holidays, late-night talks. I trusted them. I welcomed them into my life. And all along, they were hiding this twisted double life. I felt betrayed in the deepest way. I also felt scared. If they were capable of these things, what else might they do? Would confronting them put me at risk? Would they try to cover their tracks by hurting me too? I didn't want to think about that, but I had to be careful. I made a copy of everything. Screenshots, links, usernames. I saved it all to a secure drive, just in case something happened or I needed proof later. For days, I avoided them. I ignored their calls, made excuses to stay home, and kept my distance. I was terrified they might sense something was off. But I needed time to think. I needed to make the right decision. I knew going to the authorities would be serious. It meant crossing a line that would end our friendship permanently. But it also meant doing the right thing. Eventually, I made up my mind. I packed up the laptop and brought it, along with the evidence, to the police. I told them everything I had found. They listened carefully, asked for clarification, and said they would investigate. I didn't know what would happen next, but I felt a little relief knowing I had taken that step. It was no longer just my burden. The right people were now aware. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. I avoided mutual friends, avoided social media, and kept a low profile. I didn't want them to know I had said anything. I didn't know if they had figured it out yet, if they were suspicious, or if they had noticed I was gone. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Every knock at the door, every car slowing down near my house, made my heart race. Then I got a call from the police. They had confirmed several of the incidents mentioned in the posts and were planning to make an arrest. They thanked me for coming forward and said my information had been vital. I hung up and stared at the wall, stunned. It was finally happening. They would be held accountable, and I had played a part in stopping them. The news spread quickly. Word got around about the arrest, and people were shocked. No one suspected a thing. Everyone thought they were just another ordinary person. I watched the reactions online and in person, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. And I had lost a friend, but I had also prevented others from getting hurt. That was something I could live with. I never spoke to them again. I did not attend the trial. I did not respond to the messages from mutual friends asking what had happened. I moved on quietly, choosing to protect my peace. The whole experience changed me. I became more cautious, more observant. I no longer ignored red flags or brushed off strange behavior. In time, life returned to normal. I found new friendships, ones built on honesty and trust. I focused on healing, on letting go of the pain and betrayal. I could not erase what had happened, but I could learn from it. I took comfort in knowing I had done the right thing, even when it was difficult. And that, in the end, gave me a sense of closure I did not expect to find. Story 11. I was sitting in the small, sterile interrogation room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. My fingers tapped nervously against the metal table, the cold surface pressing into my palms. The detective had already asked me a series of questions, mostly about the night of the break-in. I could recall the details clearly, the faint noises, the flash of movement outside my window, but the more I spoke, the more I began to feel that something was off. The detective's eyes seemed too focused, too calculating, and his questions were increasingly pointed, probing deeper than necessary. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the situation. A break-in was a serious matter, after all, and I had been one of the few people who had seen anything unusual that night. I remembered the figures darting between the shadows, the hurried footsteps echoing through the street. But the detective was acting as though I held some secret knowledge, pressing me for details I didn't have. He was persistent, almost as though he already knew what happened, as if he was testing my story against his. The detective leaned forward, his voice lowering to a confidential tone. He asked me if I remembered anything about a specific vehicle seen near the scene. I hadn't mentioned any vehicle in my statement, there was no need to. But he was insistent. "Think," he said, his tone turning from casual to commanding. It was a white van, parked just down the street. "You didn't see it?" I shook my head, confusion washing over me. I had no memory of such a van, but the detective seemed so sure of himself, so certain. I was starting to feel cornered. Over the next few minutes, the detective continued to feed me details that didn't match my recollection of events. He described a man who supposedly matched my description, but I couldn't recognize the figure he painted. The more he spoke, the more I began to wonder if he was trying to make me believe I knew more than I actually did. He was twisting my words, slowly building a narrative that didn't align with my experience. He even mentioned a robbery technique, something I knew nothing about, but he described it in such detail that it almost made me doubt myself. Was I missing something? Could I have seen more than I realized? I tried to remain calm, but my heart began to race. I questioned everything. Had I seen something I hadn't processed? Or was this a setup? The detective wasn't letting me off the hook. He leaned in closer, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You can help us," he said. "Just tell us what you remember." But the truth was, I hadn't seen much. I wasn't sure how much help I could be. All I had were vague impressions, flashes of images that didn't make any sense together. But then he slipped up. In the middle of his interrogation, the detective mentioned something that wasn't in my original statement, something about the suspect having a distinct tattoo on his arm. I froze. I hadn't said anything about a tattoo. I hadn't seen anything like that at all. It was as though the detective was trying to implant false memories into my mind, hoping I would recall something that wasn't there. I felt a rush of unease settle in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I needed to get out of there. As the interrogation dragged on, I realized that the detective was trying to manipulate me. He was feeding me information he thought would make me cave, trying to create a version of events that matched his theory. I could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of his questions growing heavier. But I held my ground, staying silent whenever he tried to lead me in a direction I knew wasn't accurate. I wasn't sure why he was doing this, but I was beginning to suspect he had an agenda beyond solving the crime. There was a strange moment of clarity. I suddenly remembered a conversation I had overheard months ago in the precinct, something about a detective who had been known to push witnesses into false confessions. I had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was just office gossip. But now it seemed eerily relevant. Was this detective the same one they had warned about? Was he trying to trap me into saying something that could implicate me in a crime I had nothing to do with? My gut told me to be careful, but I didn't know how to get out of this mess. The detective must have noticed my hesitation because he leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. "It's not hard to be honest," he said, as though I was the one who was lying. "You don't want to make things harder on yourself." His words sent a chill down my spine. The more he spoke, the more I realized that he wasn't interested in finding the truth. He just wanted a confession, any confession, something to close the case, no matter who it hurt in the process. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being set up. But how could I prove it? I had nothing but my word against his. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, and I suddenly felt small, insignificant. But then I remembered something important. The details he had given me, the van, the tattoo, it was all so fabricated. It wasn't a coincidence. He was trying to control the narrative, trying to make me see things his way. That realization gave me the strength I needed. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me any longer. In a quiet but firm voice, I finally spoke up. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't see a van, I didn't see a tattoo, and I'm not going to make up a story to make things easier for you." The detective didn't react immediately, but I could see the shift in his posture. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time he seemed slightly taken aback. I had taken the control back. It was a small victory, but it was enough to shift the direction of the conversation. The detective tried to press again, but I refused to budge. I simply repeated my account of events, sticking to what I knew to be true. Slowly, the pressure began to ease, and the tension in the room lifted. The detective's demeanor shifted, becoming less confrontational. It was clear that he had realized I wasn't going to fall for his tactics. He sat back in his chair, seemingly defeated, and after a long pause, he stood up. "We'll let you go for now," he said flatly. but we may need to speak with you again." I didn't say anything in response. I just stood up and walked out of the room, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders with every step. As I left the precinct, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I had been in the grip of a dangerous game, but I had managed to walk away unscathed. It wasn't over, though. I still had questions about the whole situation. Why had the detective tried to manipulate me? Was I really just a witness, or was there something more to my involvement? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let anyone push me into a corner again. The truth was out there, and I would find it, no matter what. Story 12. I was always fascinated by true crime. The idea of understanding what drives people to commit horrific acts, the dark undercurrents of human nature, and the way the justice system works, it all intrigued me. I would listen to podcasts, read books, and watch documentaries for hours, often alone at night. One day I saw a local meetup group for true crime enthusiasts advertised online. It seemed like the perfect way to connect with others who shared my interest, so I eagerly signed up. The first meeting was scheduled at a coffee shop downtown, a quiet, cozy place with dark wood tables and shelves lined with books. I arrived early, excited to meet like-minded individuals who shared my obsession with murder mysteries and criminal investigations. A few people trickled in, and we exchanged pleasantries, sharing our favorite true crime stories. The group's organizer, a man in his mid-30s, greeted everyone warmly and introduced himself. He seemed friendly, approachable, and well-versed in the subject matter, which immediately made me feel at ease. As the group gathered, we all sat in a large circle. He mentioned that he had been involved with the legal side of criminal cases in the past, working as a consultant or advisor on various cases. I had no reason to question his credibility. After all, the meeting was casual, just a group of people gathering to talk about things that fascinated us. We dove into a discussion about an infamous case, one I had followed for years. The conversation flowed easily, with everyone contributing their theories, details they had uncovered, and questions about the trial's outcome. Over the next few weeks, I continued attending the meetings. They were always well organized, and everyone seemed genuinely interested in the discussions. There was a strange sense of camaraderie in the group, despite the dark nature of the topic. As the days passed, I began to feel more comfortable with everyone, but something about the organizer, the man who led the group, began to bother me. He had this unsettling way of speaking about certain cases, almost as if he had a personal stake in them. His knowledge was extensive, but it was too specific at times, and he always had this strange, almost nostalgic look when discussing certain incidents. One evening, as I walked into the coffee shop, I noticed a few police officers standing near the entrance. They weren't in uniform, but they didn't look like ordinary patrons either. They were watching the organizer intently, speaking in hushed tones. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just there by coincidence. But then, as the meeting began, the mood was different. The group was more tense than usual. It was as if everyone was aware of something, but no one was willing to speak up about it. The organizer didn't seem to notice the change. He continued talking about the case we had planned to discuss, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor. His usual confidence was replaced by a more controlled, almost calculating tone. I kept glancing at the officers, who remained standing near the door, scanning the room. It was when he mentioned a specific double homicide that I froze. The case he was describing sounded eerily familiar. It was a double homicide that had occurred a few years earlier in the city, one that had shaken the entire community. The details were vivid, and as he spoke, his voice grew almost too animated, too passionate. He didn't just know the facts, he seemed to be reliving the events as if he were there. I felt my stomach turn, a cold sweat creeping up my back. I had read about the trial, followed every piece of news, and even listened to the testimonies from witnesses. And then it hit me. The organizer was involved in that very case. He was the suspect. The realization came crashing down like a wave, and I could barely focus on the conversation. My mind raced as I tried to process the information. How had I not seen the signs before? The details, the way he spoke about the victims, it all started to make sense in a horrifying way. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my hands were clammy as I clutched my coffee cup, trying to maintain my composure. I wanted to confront him, to scream and demand the truth, but I couldn't. The officers were still standing by the door, and I wasn't sure what they knew or what they were waiting for. The meeting ended earlier than usual that night, and I quickly excused myself, my mind in a daze. I walked home in a fog, the streets blurred around me as I tried to process what had just happened. I couldn't shake the image of him, the organizer, speaking with such knowledge and control, and how he had almost seemed to relish recounting the details of that double homicide. I had to find out more. I couldn't just leave it at that, but I didn't know where to begin. The next day, I spent hours researching. I dug through online articles, news archives, and court documents. The more I read, the more certain I became. The man I had been sitting next to, sharing coffee with, and discussing true crime with, was on trial for the brutal murder of 2 people. He had been arrested shortly after the bodies were discovered, but the case had dragged on for years. There were rumors, theories, and whispers about his involvement, but nothing concrete. Now I understood why he had been so meticulous about the details, why he seemed to know things that weren't widely reported. I felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. How had I become entangled in this? Why had no one else in the group seemed to realize the truth? My heart raced with every new discovery. I had to be careful. The last thing I wanted was to get too close, to find myself in a situation I couldn't escape. But the truth kept pulling me in. I needed to know everything, to understand why he was there, organizing a meetup for people like me, when he was the one being investigated for such a horrific crime. I decided to stop attending the meetings. Every time I thought about going, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What if he recognized that I knew? What if I became a target, a witness, someone who could bring him down? The thought terrified me, but it was a reality I had to face. The group continued without me, and I tried to move on with my life, pretending that I hadn't uncovered the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being watched. A few weeks later, I saw a news story. The trial was over, and the man had been convicted of the double homicide. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the prosecution had proven his guilt. He had been hiding in plain sight all along, organizing meetups, blending in with the crowd while carrying the weight of his past crimes with him. The story made headlines, and I felt a strange sense of closure. It was over. He was behind bars, and the truth had come to light. I never spoke to anyone from the group again. The experience left me shaken, but I couldn't forget how close I had come to becoming part of something much darker. It was a lesson in the dangers of trusting the wrong people, in the way appearances can be deceiving. The world is full of mysteries, some of which are far more terrifying than we can imagine. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never look at a true crime story the same way again. The line between fiction and reality had blurred, and I had been too close to the edge. Story 13. I was rushing to finish my shift when my coworker offered me a ride home. We had both worked late, and the weather had started to get colder, with rain tapping against the windows. I wasn't sure about the offer at first, but I had no other options at the time. Public transportation would take longer, and the thought of getting soaked in the rain was unappealing. I agreed, and we headed out of the building, walking toward their car parked in the lot. As I slid into the passenger seat, I noticed something odd. A small bag was tucked under the seat, and a faint metallic gleam caught my eye. I looked closer and saw handcuffs peeking out from the bag, along with a length of rope. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately felt a sense of unease wash over me. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the thought of what those items could be used for made me nervous. The drive started off uneventfully, but the silence in the car was thick, and the unease in my stomach only grew. I casually glanced at my coworker, who was focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that there was a reasonable explanation for the handcuffs and rope. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind spiraled. What if these things weren't innocent? What if I had made a mistake by accepting this ride? I attempted to break the silence with small talk, asking about his day and the project we had been working on. He gave short responses, clearly not in the mood to talk. The tension between us felt unbearable. My eyes kept flicking to the area under the seat, but I couldn't bring myself to ask about it. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the handcuffs and rope were so out of place, so unsettling. We turned onto a quieter road, one I didn't recognize, and I began to feel more anxious. I had been in this area a few times, but not at night. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the road. My coworker's driving felt erratic, his movements a little too sharp as he swerved between lanes. It was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I clenched my hands together in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself to stay calm, that everything was fine, but my instincts told me otherwise. I thought about how to exit the car if I needed to. I could fake needing to use the restroom, or maybe tell him I had forgotten something at work, anything to get out of the situation. My mind raced as I looked out the window, trying to gauge where we were. The familiar buildings and street signs had disappeared, and the surroundings seemed more isolated. The car slowed as we passed a dark alleyway, and for a moment I thought he was going to pull over. I held my breath, my body tense, but we drove past it. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I was probably overthinking things. Yet the more I thought about the handcuffs and rope, the less sure I felt. Why did he have those items in the car? I had never seen him act strangely before, but that didn't mean much. People could hide their true selves until it was too late. The rain began to fall harder, and the windshield wipers swished rapidly to clear the glass. I could hear the rhythmic sound of the wipers and the soft hum of the engine as we continued down the road. Despite the noise, the silence in the car felt suffocating. I glanced at my coworker again, but his eyes were focused on the road, his expression unreadable. My anxiety only deepened. I had to do something, but what? Suddenly he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're quiet. Everything okay?" His tone was almost too calm, like he was trying to reassure me, or maybe even test me. I didn't know how to answer. If I said something was wrong, would he get defensive? Would he stop the car? My mind was racing with all the possible outcomes, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't feel safe. I swallowed hard before replying, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a long day. The words felt hollow as soon as I said them, but I couldn't think of anything else. I had to get out of the car, but I wasn't sure how. I wanted to trust my coworker, but my gut was screaming at me to be cautious. The handcuffs, the rope, what if I had made a terrible mistake by getting in his car? We drove on, the streets becoming even darker and more desolate. I tried to keep track of the turns he was taking, but everything was starting to look the same. I couldn't even remember how long it had been since we had left the city. My pulse quickened as the car continued down the quiet road, and I felt the weight of my decision pressing on me. I needed to be smart. If things went wrong, I had to be ready to act quickly. For another turn, and we were on a road with no lights at all. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt my chest tighten as the car slowed, and then without warning, it came to a stop. My heart was pounding in my ears as I looked around. There was nothing here but a few dilapidated buildings and empty fields. The silence was deafening. "What are we doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't meant to sound so frightened, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. He didn't answer immediately, and I could feel his eyes on me. I waited, my mind racing with every possible scenario. My pulse thudded in my throat as I thought about what I might need to do to escape. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "I just thought we could talk for a minute. You seemed a little off today." He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if he was being genuine or if there was something more behind his words. The handcuffs and rope under the seat flashed in my mind again. My instinct told me to get out of there, but I had to be careful. I forced myself to smile, hoping to mask my fear. "I'm just tired. Work's been a lot lately." I was trying to keep the conversation light, but inside I was screaming. I needed to get out, but the car was stopped, and I wasn't sure if I could get away fast enough if I made a run for it. I had to keep calm, but every fiber of my being was telling me to act, to get out of the car before it was too late. Then he started the car again, and we drove off, back toward the main road. I felt my shoulders sag in relief, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down completely. The rest of the ride felt like an eternity. The tension between us was palpable, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The car finally turned onto a more familiar street, and I could see my neighborhood in the distance. When we reached my house, I hesitated before getting out. My coworker didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Thanks for the ride," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I didn't wait for his response before quickly opening the door and stepping out. As I walked toward my front door, I looked back at the car, half expecting to see him still watching me. But the car drove away, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I stayed up for hours that night, replaying the entire ride in my mind. The handcuffs and rope haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I had been lucky this time, but I promised myself I wouldn't take any chances in the future. No ride, no matter how innocent it seemed, was worth the risk. Story 14. I was walking through the park when I saw her. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees, and she was standing by the fountain, her face turned slightly towards the sky. There was something about her that caught my eye. It wasn't just her beauty, it was the way she seemed so at ease, like the world around her had slowed down just for a moment. She was wearing a simple white dress, the kind that fluttered gently in the breeze, and her dark hair framed her face in soft waves. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone. I knew it was a bit strange, but I couldn't help myself. She was mesmerizing, and I wanted to capture the moment, maybe even have a reminder of this perfect stranger. I wasn't trying to be invasive, just fascinated by her presence. I snapped a quick photo, the lens focusing on her serene expression, before I tucked my phone away and continued my walk. The following day, I found myself scrolling through the pictures I had taken the day before. Most of them were of the scenery, but one caught my attention, the picture of her. I didn't remember much else about the park visit, but looking at the photo I felt a strange pull, as if I needed to know who she was. There was something haunting about her image, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I zoomed in on her face, studying every detail from the curve of her lips to the quiet sadness that seemed to linger in her eyes. I had a habit of going through missing persons reports from time to time. It was an odd interest, something that stemmed from a morbid curiosity. I didn't know why, but I often found myself reading through articles or looking up faces of those who had vanished without a trace. That morning, as I opened my browser, I thought I might indulge in my usual habit. It was a way to pass time, a distraction, nothing more. That's when I saw her face. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, a face that resembled hers. But as I read further, my stomach dropped. The photo on the missing persons report was dated 3 years ago, and the woman in the image was the same one I had taken a picture of. She had gone missing under strange circumstances, last seen at a park not far from where I had taken her photo. My heart raced as I read through the details. There was no mention of her being found, no mention of her whereabouts since that fateful day. I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The face in the report was the same: her eyes, her nose, her lips, and the way her hair fell around her face. I couldn't stop looking at the image. It felt as though time had somehow bent and connected those two moments, her disappearance 3 years ago and the photo I had taken just the day before. How was it possible that I had captured her image, and why did she look so peaceful, so alive, when she had been missing for so long? I went over the details in my mind. The park, the fountain, the way the sun had set behind her. It all seemed so ordinary, yet nothing about the situation felt ordinary anymore. I could feel the unease creeping in. What if she wasn't really there? What if the photo wasn't just a coincidence? I didn't know what to think, but the more I stared at the image of her on my phone, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. The report said she had been wearing a white dress the day she vanished. The description of the clothing was eerily similar to what she had worn when I saw her. Was I going crazy? Had I somehow wandered into a memory or a dream? I checked the date on my phone and then checked it again, wondering if I had somehow misread the information. I had only taken the photo the day before. The photo had to be from that day. There was no way I could have confused it with something older. Panic started to set in. I called the number on the missing persons report, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. The line rang for what seemed like an eternity before a voice answered. I hesitated for a moment before speaking, unsure of what to say. "I think I might have seen her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman on the other end was silent for a few seconds, and I could hear the sound of typing in the background. "Do you have information about her whereabouts?" the woman finally asked. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know where she was, but I had the photo. The woman asked me to describe the scene and the circumstances of the photo I had taken. I told her everything I could remember, but I wasn't sure how to explain that I had no idea why or how the photo had been taken in the first place. She asked if I could come down to the station to make a report, and I agreed, even though I still felt a sense of disbelief. When I arrived, I was led to a small room with a detective. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes, and he listened patiently as I explained everything. He asked to see the photo, and I handed over my phone. He studied the image for a long time before looking up at me. "Are you sure this is her?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. I nodded, feeling a mix of uncertainty and fear. I didn't know what to think anymore. The detective asked me to stay while they ran some checks to confirm the identity of the woman in the photo. I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing. Was I really going to be part of something bigger than I could comprehend? After a while, the detective returned with a printout of the missing persons report and a photograph of the woman from a few years ago. The picture matched, but there was one detail that left me stunned. Underneath the photo, the report listed a phone number, my phone number, the same number I had used to call in. It was listed as the last contact she had made before vanishing. My blood ran cold. How was this possible? How could I have missed something so important? The detective looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Do you remember any details about this woman?" he asked. I shook my head, the pieces of the puzzle still not fitting together. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The entire situation was spiraling into something I didn't understand. Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. I kept questioning myself, trying to piece together the fragments of that strange encounter. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were too many coincidences. Her clothing, her smile, the park, it all seemed like a carefully crafted memory, but I had no answers. Then, one evening, a breakthrough came. I was sitting in my apartment when I received an unexpected message on my phone. It was a simple text, "I'm okay now." It was from an unknown number. I stared at the message, my heart racing. Could it be her? Could she have sent this message to me? I didn't know what to think, but the message felt like an end to a chapter that had remained open for far too long. I never heard from her again, but I always kept the photo. It served as a reminder of the strange connection we shared, even if I never fully understood it. Over time, I moved on with my life, though I couldn't forget the mysterious woman and the haunting image she had left behind. Story 15. I was going through some old boxes in the attic when I came across something unexpected. There, hidden behind old books and forgotten clothes, was a stack of VHS tapes. Dust had gathered on the edges, and the labels were faded and barely legible, but one in particular caught my attention. It was labeled surveillance footage, and something about it sent a chill down my spine. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed the tape and found an old VHS player in the corner of the attic. I hadn't seen it in years, but it still worked. With a nervous hand, I slid the tape into the player and hit play, watching as the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to see that the footage was recorded right inside my home. It looked like security footage, and the scene was from the entryway. I could see a woman entering the house, looking around nervously as she stepped inside. The timestamp on the bottom corner of the screen read 2:15 a.m. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman seemed familiar, but I couldn't place her face. She moved cautiously through the hallway, glancing over her shoulder as if she was being watched. Her footsteps echoed in the empty house, and I found myself wondering what she was doing there. As she walked deeper into the house, I could see the door close behind her, the sound of it clicking shut as though it was trapping her inside. The footage continued to play, and I saw the woman enter a room on the left side of the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, and the scene changed. I watched, transfixed, as the minutes passed and the room remained empty. No one else entered, and the house seemed eerily still. But then something strange happened. The timestamp shifted forward. The woman never came back out of that room. No sign of her ever left the frame. I rewound the footage and played it again, but the result was the same. I grabbed another tape from the pile and inserted it into the player. This time the footage was from a different day. The timestamp read 3:45 p.m., and once again, a woman walked into the house. She wasn't the same as the first one, but she had the same cautious steps. She, too, looked over her shoulder as if checking to make sure she wasn't being followed. The door closed behind her, and I watched as she moved further into the house. She seemed more confident than the first woman, but the outcome was just as unsettling. I could feel my stomach tighten as I watched. The second woman entered a different room, and again, she was never seen leaving. The footage seemed to show her standing still for a moment, then the screen went black for a few seconds. When it returned, the room was empty, and the timestamp had advanced again. She had vanished, just like the first. There was no trace of either of them. My thoughts were racing. What was going on? Why did these women keep entering my home but never leave? I was starting to feel a creeping sense of dread, and I realized I had to find out more. I searched through the pile of tapes, desperate to find more clues, to understand what was happening. Tape after tape, I watched more women walk through the front door and disappear into the house. The pattern was always the same. They would enter, and they would never leave. The footage was never clear about what happened to them. The rooms they entered would be silent, as though time itself had stopped. It was as if they had simply been swallowed by the house. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare, but the worst part was that I couldn't look away. The mystery was too consuming, and I had to know what had happened to these women. I began to notice something even stranger as I watched more footage. The women all seemed to have similar traits, but they were all in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in casual clothing, and seemed to have no connection to one another. There were no screams, no signs of violence or struggle, just the eerie quiet as they walked into the house and disappeared. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would anyone have surveillance footage like this? And why had it been hidden in the attic, buried away? As I watched one of the tapes, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. It was as if the eyes of the women were following me. I could almost hear their voices in my mind, whispering to me from the darkness of the house. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. I needed answers, not more questions. But deep down, I feared what I might find if I kept looking. I decided to take a break and walk around the house, hoping to clear my mind. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt colder, quieter. The air seemed thick, as though it were heavy with secrets. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked, then moved to the back, where I noticed something strange. The door was ajar, slightly open, just wide enough for someone to slip through unnoticed. My heart raced as I stepped closer to investigate, but there was nothing there. Just an empty yard and a distant, eerie silence. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing back to the tapes, replaying the scenes over and over. What had happened to those women? Why had they entered my home and never left? The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something sinister about this house, something that had been hidden for years. I knew I had to go back to the attic and watch the remaining tapes. I had to find out the truth. When I returned to the attic the next day, the air was thick with dust. I inserted the next tape, my hands trembling. This one was different. The timestamp on the footage read 4 a.m., and the woman who entered this time was not like the others. She looked confused, as though she had been here before, but didn't remember how she got there. Her eyes darted around the entryway as she stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. This time, though, something was different. I could see something in the background, a shadow lurking near the corner of the frame. The woman hesitated, then moved cautiously toward the shadow. The footage cut out for a brief moment, then returned, showing her standing in her room with the door locked behind her. She was looking directly at the camera, her face filled with terror. The timestamp shifted forward again, but she was still there staring, never moving. Then, as if something in the room had made up its mind, the footage cut to black for good. I couldn't breathe. The weight of it hit me all at once. I wasn't just watching a mystery unfold, I was watching the last moments of these women's lives. I knew I had to get out of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. I packed a bag quickly, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. My hands were shaking as I explained everything I had seen, everything I had uncovered. The operator told me to stay calm and wait for officers to arrive. When the police arrived, they were understandably skeptical. They searched the house, going through every room, but they found nothing. No hidden rooms, no evidence of foul play, just the ordinary walls of my home. They didn't believe me. They thought I had imagined everything, or that the tapes were just some kind of elaborate hoax. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had experienced. The last thing I heard before they left was one of the officers saying something about old house quirks, but they didn't get it. They didn't understand. But I did. And I'll never forget the cold, empty look in those women's eyes, staring at me from the footage, as if they were trying to tell me something I might never be able to understand. I moved out of the house that night and haven't returned since. But even now, I can still feel their eyes on me, following me wherever I go. And I'll never be sure if I was just the next one to be trapped, or if I truly escaped. Story 16. I had been working at my company for over 3 years when I first started noticing this strange behavior. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just odd little things that seemed off. I remember the first time I felt uncomfortable. My HR manager gave me a look that lingered a little too long when I walked by his office. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid, but as days went on, the situation escalated. It was subtle at first, but there were repeated instances where I felt like I was being targeted. He'd make offhand comments about my appearance, or ask questions that felt more personal than they should. One day after a meeting, he lingered behind everyone else and asked if I was doing okay. There was something about his tone that made me uneasy, but I didn't say anything to anyone. And at that point, I didn't want to jump to conclusions or make a scene. But things took a turn when I started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night. The first call woke me up at 2 a.m. The voice on the other end was distorted, but I could still hear the menace in it. They didn't say anything specific, just threats empty, vague threats, but they were enough to get my heart racing. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a sinking feeling that it was someone from work. The calls kept coming, at all hours of the night. Sometimes they'd hang up as soon as I answered. Other times they'd say something chilling before disconnecting. "You'll regret it," one of the messages said. "You can't run from this." It was becoming clear that whoever was behind these calls had access to my personal information, because the things they said made it seem like they knew things no stranger could. They knew where I lived, and once they even mentioned something about my job, hinting that I wasn't as safe as I thought. At first, I thought it was just some random person playing a sick prank. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to feel like something far more sinister. The idea that it was someone from work kept gnawing at me, especially after the strange incidents with the HR manager. I decided to confide in a close colleague, hoping they might have some insight or advice. They listened, but their reaction was mixed, concerned, yet skeptical. They suggested I report it, but I wasn't sure what to say. How could I prove it was someone at work, let alone the HR manager? I didn't want to create a bigger issue, especially not at the risk of my job. But the calls didn't stop. Every night, without fail, I'd get one or two always the same unsettling silence or the cryptic threats. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. One morning, after the third call in a single night, I made the decision to report it. I went to my manager, telling them I was receiving harassing phone calls. They seemed concerned and promised to look into it. But part of me felt like they didn't fully understand the severity of the situation. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on my work, but I couldn't concentrate. The phone calls continued, and my anxiety kept building. I was on edge all the time, constantly checking my phone, afraid to answer unknown numbers. Then one day, while I was in a meeting, I received yet another call. I let it go to voicemail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person on the other end was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I kept a record of every call, documenting the time, the date, and the vague threats. When I brought this to my manager, I was met with the same response. They promised to investigate, but nothing seemed to change. The calls continued, and my confidence started to erode. I felt more and more isolated at work, like I was living in a constant state of fear. Then, one day, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to install a call blocking app, hoping to stop the harassment. But to my surprise, the calls didn't stop, they actually increased. It was as though the person on the other end was taunting me, testing my boundaries. I started to wonder if I'd ever get out of this nightmare. That was when it clicked. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. What if the calls were coming from inside the company? I started to pay closer attention to the HR manager's behavior, and everything began to fall into place. The lingering looks, the personal questions, the way he always seemed to be around when I was alone. Could he be the one making those calls? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fit together. I felt sick to my stomach at the thought of confronting him, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know for sure, I set up a plan to gather evidence. The next time I got a call, I would record it. But this time, I was going to do something different. Instead of answering the call immediately, I waited. When the phone rang, I let it go to voicemail, but this time I stayed silent, hoping the person on the other end would say something that could confirm my suspicions. After a few minutes, I heard a voice, muffled but unmistakable. It was the HR manager. My blood ran cold as I listened to his voice leave the same cryptic threat. I knew then that I had to act fast. I immediately went to my manager and showed them the recorded call, explaining what had been happening. I wasn't sure how they would react, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and let this continue. The evidence was undeniable, and I felt a sense of relief flood over me as I handed over the recording. My manager promised to take immediate action, and within days the HR manager was placed on leave while the investigation took place. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, but in the end I was glad I spoke up. The company took the situation seriously, and the HR manager was eventually terminated. I was left with a sense of justice, knowing I had done the right thing by standing up for myself. The phone calls stopped, and life slowly returned to normal. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I could sleep peacefully. I learned something through all of this. It's not just about reporting harassment, but also having the courage to confront it, even when the person causing it is in a position of power. The fear and anxiety I felt were overwhelming at times, but in the end, I was able to take control of the situation. I knew I had done the right thing, and that was what mattered most. Story 17. I had been meaning to sell my old couch for months, but between work and taking care of things at home, I kept putting it off. Finally, I posted an ad online, hoping to get a quick sale. It wasn't the fanciest couch, but it was still comfortable, and I was sure someone would want it. The buyer messaged me that they were interested and asked if I could deliver it. I agreed, figuring it would be a quick transaction. The address they gave me was a bit further out of the way than I expected, but I didn't mind. I packed the couch into the back of my van and set off, following the directions provided. The road was quiet, and the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. I had been driving for about 20 minutes when I arrived at the house. It was a small, run-down place on the edge of a forest, with overgrown grass and a weathered fence. The house looked abandoned, the windows dusty, and the front door barely hanging on its hinges. I parked my van and looked around for a sign of life. Just then, I saw the door creak open, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. The person was tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and looked nothing like the image I had imagined. I got out of the van and waved awkwardly, feeling a sense of unease settle over me. The buyer didn't wave back or greet me in the usual way. Instead, they just stared at me for a moment before turning back into the house. I took a deep breath and followed them up to the porch, my steps hesitant. Something felt off, but I brushed it off as just nerves. As I stepped onto the porch, the buyer reappeared, holding the door open for me. They didn't speak, only motioning for me to bring the couch inside. I hesitated again, feeling a growing tension in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I carefully maneuvered the couch through the doorway and into the dimly lit living room. The space was cluttered, with old furniture stacked in corners and boxes scattered across the floor. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creaking of the floorboards under my feet. The buyer pointed toward a small room off to the side, indicating that I should set the couch down there. I nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. As I walked toward the room, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, no one was there. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the house settling. I set the couch down in the room, and the buyer quickly stepped in front of me, blocking my exit. They didn't say anything, just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to move past them, but they put a hand on my arm, stopping me. Their grip was firm, almost too firm, and I felt my heart race. It wasn't until then that I noticed something strange. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, a heavy silence that didn't match the usual noise of a busy home. The buyer's eyes never left me, and their mouth was set in a tight line. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound calm. The buyer didn't answer. Instead, they turned abruptly and motioned toward the door. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what they were doing, leading me outside. I followed them reluctantly, my mind racing with 100 questions. When we reached the back of the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shed at the far end of the yard, and the buyer was dragging someone unconscious toward it. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I could hear the rustling of the leaves in the trees above, and the quiet creak of the door opening. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising in alarm. The buyer didn't respond, continuing to drag the limp figure toward the shed with a disturbing calmness. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. "Who is that?" I asked,